I'll begin with a warning. This book club is something that I'm doing for fun, and it's not intended to be a really smart or in-depth review of a book. So if you found this because you're like a really big fan of a certain book, or you're really intellectually curious about it, you're probably going to be mad because I'm probably going to say stupid things about the book to be funny, and all in all be a very shallow person, which is what I am. Actually, mid-video, I realized I wanted to make another warning. So this book is about violence, and it rather explicitly deals with topics such as rape, murder, domestic abuse, and like mass shootings and other things that if you don't want to hear about those things, then you may not want to watch my video. The second thing is at times I'm going to make fun of things in the book that I think are silly, so that may sometimes involve me making jokes about those subjects. So again, if that bothers or offends you, probably not the best video, but there's several other videos on YouTube that you might like, and you could watch those instead. Okay, so I used to be a really voracious reader, and I've kind of gotten out of the habit, but for whatever reason, I am still in the habit of constantly collecting books because I find them by the side of the road and in free boxes and like at garage sales, and I just like collect any book that seems interesting. So I figured since I have so many of them and I haven't read almost any of them, I would just try to get in the habit of just reading a book all the time. It's really funny because I'm reading this book, which is basically about like dangerous situations and like people attacking you. And when I'm reading a book like very absorbedly, I tend to read it like while I'm walking around and like walking down the street, which I just think that's funny because I feel like a lot of people think that's unsafe behavior. So I think it's funny that I'm walking around reading The Gift of Fear. So basically this book is about, I've only like just started it. I'm like 30 pages into like a 400 page book. My knowledge of this book is that some people really swear by it, and it's, as far as I can tell, it's basically about like assessing whether a person is threatening to you, like whether they might be physically violent to you, or like whether someone who's verbally threatening you is actually going to hurt you, or like whether somebody is going to become threatening or abusive later. It starts out with a story about a girl being approached by a strange guy who offers to help her carry her groceries, and then he, this is dark stuff, so content warning, but then the guy rapes her, and so it talks about like how she might have like, okay, this is what I already kind of feel uncomfortable with. Like, it seems kind of victim blaming, this idea of saying that like you could have like known that somebody was going to rape you, and like, okay, maybe it's dumb for me to say that's victim blaming if it really is true that you could have told, like that you could have definitely known, but like I'm not convinced. And I feel like the author, Gavin de Becker, tries to like prove that you can tell by saying that all these people who've been through like traumatic experiences or just narrowly avoided a traumatic experience, he's saying that like they looked back and they said, oh, like I'm sure like I saw that they did like this one weird thing, or like I had a bad feeling about like that place or that person. But I don't actually think this proves anything. It's like basic confirmation bias. Like if you had a bad feeling about someone and then they didn't do anything to you, you just wouldn't remember. So like the fact that like when you had a bad feeling and they did do something, that doesn't mean your bad feelings are like super accurate. You know, I will have to see what I think, but this aspect of the book makes me like somewhat uncomfortable because I'm not sure that I believe it, and it just, you know, if it's true, it's great, but if it's not true, it's bad enough when bad things happen to a person without saying that they should have been able to know that it was going to happen. So I thought I would just try to briefly describe how I got into the trauma business. Several years ago now, I met somebody through my old blog, and as often happens when I met people through that blog, we became good friends because we had a lot in common. And we were friends for about a year and a half, and then we were in a relationship for like a year. And after the relationship ended and we weren't in contact anymore, it was kind of like surfacing from being under a spell. Like, I realized that when I was with this person, things had slowly gotten to a point where I was afraid to not do everything that she told me to do, and it was hard for me to even disagree with her inside my own head. And even though there were some scary things about the situation, I like wasn't scared at all, and I saw the situation as like fairly normal until it was over. And when it did end, it was just kind of by a coincidence. So it wasn't even until after it ended that I was like, whoa, like if I'd stayed in this situation any longer, I might not have been able to get out. And I didn't even realize how weird it was or how little control I had at the time. I've obviously tried to make this part of the video several times because it's really hard to do a brief description of what happened, because what happened is like pretty weird and I can't fully describe it, like even years later. Like if you're like, how did this person have so much control over you? I'm like, so that happened. Anyway, I think that was probably one of the most, one of the most life-changing events of my life. And it both made me like more paranoid than a person should be. There are times when I feel like that experience like robbed me of my innocence, but there's also times when I feel like my innocence isn't something that I really wanted to have. Like if innocence means like not standing up for yourself or recognizing that sometimes other people mean you harm and you're not just being like crazy or difficult if you won't let somebody treat you in a certain way, then like I don't miss my innocence. And I think for me there's always been like, ever since then, I've kind of been struggling with this trade-off where I'm very interested in thinking about these things and trying to hopefully never be in a situation like that again, and trying to be more aware, like protecting myself more and being more aware of other people's behavior problems and like what kind of people might be dangerous or, you know, just not have other people's best interests at heart or be given to certain behavior. But at the same time, like, I don't want to be thinking about that stuff so much that like I can't even like live my life or trust anyone. So to me, happiness lies somewhere in between those two poles, where you're neither obsessed with protecting yourself nor unable to protect yourself. And I guess that's why I'm interested in reading stuff like this. Anyway, so I've said kind of what my thoughts are going into the book. So far, having read like 30 pages, the most annoying thing about it is not what it's about, but something I've seen other people complain about, which is the fact that the guy is like so much bragging about his job, which is as like sort of an expert on violent behavior who advises like celebrities and politicians and like really important people about this kind of stuff. And so he like goes on like describing how like important his job is and like all the important people that he's worked with, but he's not telling you who his clients are because he's such a great guy. And then like in the middle of talking about his corporation, there's this paragraph that sounds like it's from an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? I'm sorry, let me get a lighter. Among all the weird ventures in America, could you ever have imagined a literal warehouse of alarming and unwelcome things that stalkers have sent to the objects of their unwanted pursuit? Things like 1,000-page death threats, phone book-thick love letters, body parts, dead animals, facsimile bombs, razor blades, and notes written in blood? Would you have imagined that there is a building containing more than 350,000 obsessive and threatening communications? Many of my 70 associates work in just such a building. There they cast light on the darkest parts of our culture, seeking every day to improve our understanding of hazard, and every day helping people manage fear. So aside from that, he also just comes off as kind of a jerk, like when he describes himself talking to people. Like, I think if he just said his ideas and he didn't insert these scenes of him talking to people, it would be fine. But like, for example, just listen to this and imagine if you had a friend who spoke to you like this. People tend to invest all kinds of intuitive ability in dogs, a fact I was reminded of recently when a friend told me this story. Ginger had a really bad reaction to our new building contractor. She even growled at him. She seemed to sense that he isn't trustworthy, so I'm going to get some bids from other people. That must be it, I joked with her. The dog feels you should get another general contractor because this one's not honest. The irony, I explained, is that it's far more likely Ginger is reacting to your signals than that you are reacting to hers. Like, can you imagine if you had a friend and he, like, made fun of you like that? Also, just, there's a story about a psychiatrist whose patient reported, "Recently, when my wife goes to bed, I find some excuse to stay downstairs until she's asleep. If she's still awake when I get to our room, I'll stay in the bathroom for a long time so that I'm sure she's asleep by the time I get into bed. Do you think I'm unconsciously trying to avoid having sex with my wife?" The psychiatrist astutely asked, "What was the unconscious part?" So, anyway, I'm only a little bit into the book, so I will come back when I've read more of it. I can't believe how much time I just spent making this video when it's about, like, the first, 35 pages of the book. But I'll come back when I've read a lot more. Hey, it's your friend Amanda checking in about The Gift of Fear. The book actually hasn't really done anything to offend me or bother me. I'm liking it more than I expected to. He basically goes into stuff that is useful so far. Let's see. I'm in page 100 and something. So let's see. He talks about how people want to think that anybody who's really violent or commits a crime is a monster, and they don't have anything in common with them. So he kind of talks about the fact that he thinks you should just see those people as just people, and then if you understand people's motivations and reasons for doing things, even if the things they do are horrible, then you're better able to predict what's going to happen. So it's much better to do that. Talks about making predictions. Sorry, now I'm having trouble summarizing this. Basically, so far, the book is pretty smart. It has a long section about women being approached by men, and how you can judge that a man is being, well, basically something he said, which I thought was smart. He's not saying everybody who approaches you wants to kill you. He kind of makes a point of listing different tactics that specifically in his examples, men use when they're approaching strange women, and ways that men are trying to make women feel like they have to talk to them or make them feel bonded to them and stuff like that. But he makes a point of saying, sometimes a guy is just kind of being sleazy and hitting on a girl. It doesn't necessarily mean the person is dangerous, but that it's good to be aware of these tactics and when people are using them. Seems smart to me. In the chapter about criminals and mass murderers and seeing them as people and not monsters, he rather he admits that not everybody who grew up in a violent home or something is violent themselves, but I felt he could have done that a little more, just because, I don't know, I feel there's a lot of stigma, and a lot of people who grew up in abusive homes struggle with feeling they're going to be violent, and I feel he doesn't do enough to not make it sound it's a done deal, even though obviously he himself is a counterexample. But I don't know, I guess maybe I'm just looking for a different book. I just think he could have said something about that. Yeah, so basically so far the book is alright. What I've heard about it is that from people who recommend it, that the domestic violence chapter is really bad. That's kind of a bummer for me, because part of the thing about the book is this is interesting, but a lot of it doesn't really affect me personally, or is situations that I'm fairly unlikely to be in, being approached by a random person who wants to kidnap me and kill me. I'm much more likely to be in danger in a relationship or by somebody that I know, and so far the book mostly is talking about whether some random person wants to do stuff to you. So it's not necessarily the things that keep me up at night, while it might be interesting to read, from a distant perspective and just find theoretically interesting. Anyway, so for now, the main reason I'm making this video right now, when I haven't gotten around to it, is because I'm moving, and I'm in the process of finding a new room to move into. So, I might go over today to see a new room. So I was like, wow, I'm gonna go to someone's house that I don't know. I feel a little nervous. I'll try to use the skills from the book to figure out if they're planning to kill me, because unfortunately I'm the kind of person who does always think about things like that. So, yeah. Anyway, I did still find some parts of the book, even though I thought it was pretty okay, to be like a little douchey, similar to the part that I read earlier where he was like, oh yeah, your dog totally has an intuition. So I just wanted to read some more of the parts where I was like, dude, like, you're being a dick. Okay. Our intuition fails when it is loaded with inaccurate information. Since we are the editors of what gets in and what is invested with credibility, it is important to evaluate our sources of information. I explained this during a presentation for hundreds of government threat assessors at the Central Intelligence Agency, making my point by drawing on a very rare safety hazard, kangaroo attacks. I told the audience that about 20 people a year are killed by the normally friendly animals, and that kangaroos always display a specific set of indicators before they attack. I asked 2 audience members to stand up and repeat back the warning signs that I listed. Everyone in the room will remember those warning signs for life. The problem, I told the audience at the CIA, is that I made up those signals. I did it to demonstrate the risks of inaccurate information. I actually know nothing about kangaroo behavior. Sorry, my hair. No, unacceptable. I hate it. I hate it so much. I don't want it to the side. I don't want it going straight down. Why can't it just cooperate and be in some kind of appropriate middle place, a place that my hair will never go? Anyway, one of the parts that I didn't like also is the same thing that I was complaining about, where something bad happens to someone and I feel like he's insisting that the person should have known or that they did know and they just ignored it, and I'm like, dude, you've got no proof. So it's talking about this lady, and her son was going to get surgery, and when the anesthesiologist came in, she got a really bad feeling, and so did her son, and a voice in her mind told her to cancel the operation, and she decided that it wasn't logical and she shouldn't say anything, and it turned out that the doctor was terrible, and he slept while he was doing surgery, and the little boy died. This is one of the things where I'm like, you're just being mean to somebody who lost their son. It was the doctor's fault, and obviously the hospital's fault for not realizing that he wasn't competent. She had a bad feeling, but sometimes people have a bad feeling and nothing happens, so it just seems kind of mean. Also, okay, I feel like that story is a good example of a time when listening to an impulse could be pretty bad. If it was really difficult for you to get an appointment for a certain surgery, that's an example of a time when you do kind of feel it's not just that you're embarrassed or that you're afraid of what somebody will think of you or something if you listen to your intuition. It's that if you listen to your intuition for no reason, you might have trouble getting your kid the surgery that they needed because you randomly canceled the surgery for no reason. Just a thought, I feel in most situations that would have been the right decision, and it would have just been a weird thought. I don't know why this made me laugh. It's kind of funny also because he made this really big deal out of how America is so violent and the most terribly violent place, and we have so many guns. And then in the next chapter or whatever, he's oh, actually people want to say that other countries aren't violent, or that certain groups of people aren't violent, but actually everybody, all groups of people are violent. Duh. This made me laugh for some reason. Though we live in space-age times, we still have Stone-Age minds. We are competitive and territorial and violent, just like our simian ancestors. There are people who insist that this isn't so, who insist that they could never kill anyone, but they invariably add a telling caveat. Unless, of course, a person tried to harm someone I love. For the record, this isn't true for me, and I don't seriously think about killing other people, although he insists that everyone does. And I mean, I'm quite a douchebag, but I just don't do that, and I think many people do not. Sorry. Oh, also, this is just Will Graham. Studying and interviewing those who use violence to reach their goals, I long ago learned that I must find in them some part of myself, and more disturbingly at times find in myself some part of them. There must be a place to hook the line before I drop down into the dark mine of some dark mind. There must be something familiar to hold on to. This is where I was oh, this is kind of like Hannibal. Then, a man kills a cow with an axe, cuts open the carcass, and then climbs inside to see what it feels like. Later, he uses the axe to kill his 8-year-old stepbrother. Another man murders his parents by shooting out their eyes with a shotgun. I know this probably is true, but it does sound like it was invented by Brian Fuller. Just as a surgeon loses his aversion to gore, so does the violent criminal. You can spot this feature in people who do not react as you might to shocking things. When everyone else who just witnessed a hostile argument is shaken up, for example, this person is calm. I will call bullshit on this a little bit. I think it's another thing where, yeah, maybe I, like, have too high standards for the book. I feel anxious about how this, like, affects people who, like, are mentally ill, autistic, or traumatized, or whatever. Like, you know, sometimes when people have a certain set of experiences or, like, a certain emotional setup, they may react differently or not, like, visibly show that they're upset by things, or indeed, like, maybe if you grew up with a lot of, like, violence around, like, maybe you don't react that much, but I feel like there's already a lot of stigma against people like that, and I think one reason it bugs me is because some people who are, like, abusers or dangerous people can actually be, like, the most charming and, like, normal seeming people superficially, and, you know, seem quite empathetic and emotional. And so it makes me anxious because I feel like by saying stuff like this, it kind of doesn't let you know about those kind of people, but I also feel like it increases the stigma of people who already have a lot of stuff going on. And I think specifically something that I find tough and sad is the idea that sometimes when people have been through a lot of violent or scary stuff, like, the very fact that they've been through those things then makes it harder for them to connect with other people or be seen as safe. Like, just the fact of having had someone else be scary to you can, like, make you become scary to other people. At least if there's this idea that, you know, not reacting enough to violence or being too used to violence or whatever is, like, a sign that you're creepy. Again, he does, like, pay lip service to the fact that not everyone who's like this is violent, but I don't know, I guess it just bugs me a bit. I feel like he should put some more effort into saying that. Again, I'm probably being unfair and expecting this book to be about something totally different, since it's not really about that. Oh, this is, like, this is the douchiest part. He's talking to this girl who was raped and almost killed. He's telling her about, like, how a lot of the time predatory criminals, quote unquote, come across as being very nice. And he tells her this, and Kelly nods and reminds me that her attacker was very nice. I tell her about a rhyme by Edward Gorey, the master of dark humor. The proctor buys a pupil ices and hopes the boy will not resist when he attempts to practice vices few people even know exist. Was this the appropriate time to, like, whip out your Edward Gorey quote? Maybe he could read her, like, the Ghastly Crumb Tinies and tell her that those are all the different potential ways that her rapist might have killed her but didn't. Like, maybe Edward Gorey just wasn't appropriate for talking to somebody who was raped and almost killed about the fact that that happened. Oh, I forgot to say that now I might go look at a room, so I'll tell you if I used any of my fear skills. I didn't end up going, so I have no news, but I did think of another way that Gavin de Becker could have shared his Edward Gorey fandom with the rape survivor. He could have told her about the book The Doubtful Guest and compared it to the way that she was doubtful about somebody, but she allowed them into her home, and then they perpetrated a horrific crime. This is embarrassing. I have to say that I actually thought this book was fine. I don't know if I agree with everything in it or necessarily take his word for everything. And I also think, like, yeah, okay, we're gonna go back and say that if people have anxiety, he obviously, like, places way too much faith in the idea that you can just, like, naturally, intuitively, like, if you really think about it or, like, address things the right way or think about your feelings the right way, you'll be able to figure out what's real fear, which is, like, your intuition telling you that somebody's dangerous or the situation is dangerous, and what's just, like, anxiety or worry. Like, in the last chapter of the book, which is called The Gift of Fear, he, like, specifically addresses this and is like, oh, when people worry, like, that's just, like, a bad habit, and it actually gets in your way and it keeps you from really noticing what's going on around you because you're just, like, worried. I'm gonna sneeze. I wonder if out in the wide world of YouTube, anybody who has a sneezing fetish is watching this video, and if they are, I hope that you enjoyed that surprise sneeze. Definitely the only kind of fetish video I will ever do. So, anyway, the last chapter is called The Gift of Fear, and it's about the idea that, you know, people worry about things they shouldn't worry about. Like, for example, he says that, like, you know, women are out in the dark and they're like, oh, I'm afraid someone's going to attack me, and they're just, like, thinking about it so much that they're not paying attention to their surroundings, which makes sense, I guess. It makes sense in theory, but I don't really think that, like, you know, he's just kind of saying that you can always tell the difference, but I don't really think that that's true. And, like, I think especially when you think about people who stuff has happened to, when people develop, like, PTSD and stuff, like, I think part of that is that sometimes you and your body really can't tell the difference, like, between situations that are physically dangerous and ones that aren't. I don't know, like, I'm not sure I agree with that, but, like, I think what's kind of interesting is I think maybe the book becomes a lot better if you just look at it logically and you just take all the suggestions that are logical and you don't, like, read the intuition parts, or, like, don't take those parts so seriously. Because, like, in the epilogue, he goes on and he's like, oh, there's all these people that my book really helped, like, let's listen to their stories of how they listen to their intuition. But it was kind of weird because their stories, like, weren't about intuition. Like, I felt like one of the most interesting things in this book was how he, like, talked about a lot of situations where somebody was obviously dangerous and threatening to somebody else, like at work or at school or something like that, and how, like, the people around them, like, were all in denial, and, like, they just didn't take it seriously that the person was dangerous, and something bad obviously happened in most of these situations. But I feel like the problem here shouldn't be characterized so much as they didn't listen to their intuition, but, like, they were in denial and they weren't being logical. And I feel like the examples that he uses of people listening to their intuition are actually, like, people who just were like, oh, okay, this, like, really unstable, threatening, abusive person is probably dangerous, and didn't listen to other people who were like, oh, like, it's fine, you know? Like, I don't, but, like, the book was really smart. I think, like, I was set against the book because of the idea that, like, oh, intuition, but, like, I actually think it's not even, that's not even the point, really. I'm just gonna go over some of the, like, different chapters and things that I thought were interesting. Promises to Kill was an interesting chapter. It was obviously about when people make death threats and stuff. I probably read it too long ago to summarize it really well, but I thought it was interesting. Like, this is kind of stuff that, like, I read and it sounds really legit and interesting, but in the back of my head I do kind of feel like, okay, is this, like, pop psychology, or is this actually true? How do I know? It was interesting to read, however. He was saying things that, like threats that people make early in a fight are less, you should be less scared of them because they're not, they haven't been thought through. They're just impulsive things that people say out of anger. Later on, the threats are more serious. He was also saying that a lot of the time, people who make actual explicit death threats are less likely to kill someone, which was interesting. Persistence was a really interesting chapter, and probably the most helpful one for me, because I feel like the type of situations that I'm afraid of are often, like, interpersonal situations where people are being, you know, too much, no boundaries. And so it was interesting. It talked about various interpersonal situations and how you would deal with people like that. Sorry, this is really boring because I'm just summarizing the book. So the domestic violence chapter, which I heard was, like, terribly offensive or something. On the one hand, I don't want to be really off the cuff and make, like, a bunch of dumb comments about domestic violence, like, I know what I'm talking about. Like, I know that I haven't been in a relationship where I was in physical danger. I had my tough experience, which I've talked about, and it did affect me in a lot of ways, including physical fear responses a lot in situations where they don't make sense, but, you know, I can't really compare it, and I don't want to say that I know what I'm talking about. However, I feel like it's not really accurate to say that he was victim blaming, or that he was saying, like, staying in an abusive relationship is a choice, and now I sound like an asshole because that's exactly what he did say, but, like, I feel like there's different ways of saying that. Like, there's two poles, which I guess I was talking about before. The two poles are tough. Like, on the one hand, I think people often use, you know, people use any kind of way of saying like, oh, you could have predicted that someone was going to abuse you, or like you could have done this to avoid it, people often use that to like attack the survivor or say that what happened to them wasn't really bad or didn't really count as abuse. Like I can think of several examples, recently in the media where somebody has come out and said that somebody else abused them, and then like the response is like, oh, didn't you know that was going to happen? Or like, oh, well, you were dumb for like putting yourself in the situation where they would abuse you. And like the implication is that like the abuser is like blameless for doing this just because the person was there. And like, a lot of the time it's like, well, like they didn't have any way of knowing. But even if they had, like, that doesn't make what they did any less bad. Like if I walked up to a baby and like kicked it in the face, that may be very easy to do because it's a baby, but like that doesn't mean that it was fine. Like, you could arguably say that, when people are very young or like vulnerable or looking for a job, abusing them may be easier, but it's quite bad. Like, it doesn't really make sense. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think that's why a lot of people, including me, like very much get their back up when they see somebody saying stuff like, it's a choice, like you made bad decisions that led to you being in an abusive relationship, stuff like that. And that does get my back up, but I think what he's going for isn't ever saying that it's the victim's fault or that the abuser didn't do something bad. I think he's trying to possibly give people who are trying to get away from someone like the hope that there's a way that they can actually do that, instead of, because it's hard to get to the medium between not blaming yourself for things that someone else did to you, but also like hopefully not seeing yourself as like completely helpless and having no control, because maybe neither thing is true. And I think he's just trying to encourage people that they have control and like they could try to leave. I don't know, that's just what I thought about it. I will say, like, the chapter was helpful in terms of what not to do, but, he basically made a point, and frequently makes a point, of saying that people use things like restraining orders and, like, security guards and guns to make themselves feel safe and like they've gotten rid of the danger and like they're addressing the danger, but they really aren't. Those things like don't directly address the problem. For example, if you get security guards but they're not well trained, that doesn't help. If you have a gun but you don't know how to use it and like somebody who's attacking you like grabs it away from you, you just made everything worse. And he says that like restraining orders don't really help, because if someone is like really violent and like wants to hurt their ex-partner, they're still going to do it even if there's a restraining order, and that the restraining order can, be something that like everyone thinks the woman needs to do to be safe, so like she does it, but it actually just like creates a false sense of security if it does anything and makes stuff like more dangerous. So that was an interesting thing to know and have in mind. I will say, he kind of goes on and is like, okay, if you're in a relationship with someone who's really violent and really wants to kill you, here's all the awful stuff that's going to happen to you. But maybe he didn't give the most concrete ideas about like what to do, but I do feel like if I'm ever in that situation, I will at least know what not to do. And this isn't the only book in the world, so hopefully other books could address that better. One of the most disturbing chapters is called Fear of Children, and okay, I was gonna make fun of this because he's like he introduces it by saying, oh, I've learned a lot about violence from young people who killed others, some who killed themselves, and as you'll see in the next chapter, one who did a little of both. I was like, how did he kill himself a little? He shot off some of his face, and then he died. So, okay, that's fair. Anyway, this chapter was really disturbing. It was like a lot about kids that were violent. This is another unfair criticism. People said that Gavin de Becker blames like violent kids on like metal music and stuff like that, but I feel like that's really not accurate. Like he really just talks about the way that, if people are too into media and they're also messed up anyway, and media is like their whole life, So at this point, the book kind of gets interesting because it turns into just kind of this true crime book about, like, assassins and stuff. But I'm not sure that it's actually that, like, helpful for personal things. I think, like, weirdly, the book, kind of veers between, like, personal situations that are very relatable and helpful and just, like, true crime, look at me and my awesome job. There's one chapter where he's talking about an assassin. That's the extreme hazards chapter, which, like, just totally veers into, like, this is my cool job. We were tracking down an assassin, which was fine. But, it's not really, it doesn't really fit with the theme of the book that much. And it's also kind of funny because he's like, oh, he was tracking down this actress. And, like, I won't say who it is, but she's one of my best friends. Then in the acknowledgments, you find out that it's Michelle Pfeiffer. Oh, I never realized that there was, like, a picture of him before. He's very cute. I do just want to have you gaze into his face and listen to that scary quote from the beginning because, like, you will laugh. Okay. Among all the weird ventures in America, could you ever have imagined a literal warehouse of alarming and unwelcome things that stalkers have sent to the objects of their unwanted pursuit? Things like 1,000-page death threats, phone book, thick love letters, body parts, dead animals, facsimile bombs, razor blades, and notes written in blood. Would you have imagined that there's a building containing more than 3,500,000 obsessive and threatening communications? Many of my 70 associates work in just such a building. There, they cast light on the darkest parts of our culture, seeking every day to improve our understanding of hazard, and every day helping people manage fear. I don't know. I mean, some author photos, I guess, like, he felt like he couldn't smile because of what the book is about, but it's really funny. This is just one of the times when he tried to make a hilarious joke. Researchers found an article with a headline that at first seemed relevant. This is about a study showing, like, if people have actually been hurt by listening to certain types of music. Man killed while listening to heavy metal music. The victim, it turned out, was walking along listening to an Ozzy Osbourne tape on headphones when he was struck by a train. On the news clipping, a dark-humored associate of mine had written the words, "Killed by heavy metal." Literally. The heavy metal in trains surely has resulted in many more deaths than the heavy metal in music, even so-called death metal music. There are 2 rules about fear that, if you accept them, can improve your use of it, reduce its frequency, and literally transform your experience of life. That's a big claim, I know, but don't be afraid to consider it with an open mind. This is one of the parts where I totally agree with him, but he just sounds so obnoxious. I recently met a middle-aged couple from Florida who had just obtained licenses to carry concealed handguns. The man explained why. Because if some guy walks into a restaurant and opens fire, I want to be in a position to save lives. Of course, there are plenty of things he could carry on his belt that would be far more likely to save lives in a restaurant. An injection of adrenaline would treat anaphylactic shock. Or he could carry a small, sharp tube to give emergency tracheotomies to people who are choking to death. Now, how would you feel if, like, somebody who had no medical training started trying to give you a tracheotomy? When I asked him if he carried one of those, he said, I could never stick something into a person's throat, but he could send a piece of lead into a person's flesh, like a rocket. Okay, this is the only joke in the book that I found funny. He's complaining about, like, the news and saying that the news, like, makes people too afraid of, like, unlikely or made-up crimes. Soon it will be robbers who hide out in your purse until you get home, followed by a checklist of warning signs to look out for. Purse feels extra heavy. Purse difficult to close. Unusual sounds coming from purse. So overall, this was, like, a pretty good book. I wasn't like, whoa, it's totally the best, but I actually think the worst thing about it is... Well, okay, first of all, it's just, like, several books in one. I feel like it's about several different subjects, and sometimes it's just kind of like, listen to all this true crime. Oh, I forgot one of my criticisms is, he's like, oh, every assassin does, like, these things, and then he has, like, a long list of things every assassin does, and some of them are, like, actually, like, assassiny, but some of them are, like, writes songs, keeps a diary, like, okay. Anyways, I felt like the book was like a lot of different books. Sometimes it's about interesting facts about assassins, sometimes it's about I'm so cool, sometimes it's about domestic violence, and to me the most interesting parts were the parts about, strange men approaching women, like, dudes being creeps when they're dating women, like randos like being super weird to people at work and like just pushing their boundaries and stuff like that. I thought a lot of those parts were the most interesting. I also was really interested in the parts about denial and the ways that, like, you know, schools and workplaces often aren't as safe as they should be, or the ways that they try to be safe are not actually like that helpful, even though they may look impressive. Anyway, I found a lot of stuff about the book to be interesting. What was my original point? It's like a lot of books in one, and I think he acts weirdly woo-woo about things that are actually just logical. You know, I think basically the point of this book should be like, you know, here's some ways you can try to pay attention to see, like, if somebody's likely to try to do something bad to you, and, like, here's some things that you could do if you think that's going to happen. I have to admit that I do feel like, you know, 1% better since reading the book. So, yeah, I can wholeheartedly recommend it as something that is interesting and possibly helpful to read.